Welcome, enlightened ones. Never let your cup get full. We will begin with AI's blind interpretation. Prepare to witness what the algorithms predict.
Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're going to do something truly fascinating. We are going to peel back the thematic layers of a piece of music that, on its surface, feels incredibly hostile. We're looking at Tool's track Cold and Ugly from their album Opiate. Now, if you know this track, you know it comes out swinging. But as we unpack the source text today, we're going to see that what looks like a literal fistfight is actually a deeply profound confession about shared human fear. It's honestly an incredible piece of psychological misdirection. We absolutely have to start right at the beginning. This track is live, and this is the very first thing you hear before the music even really kicks in. Throw that Bob Marley wannabe motherfucker out of here. It is an aggressive, genuinely hostile shout directed into a crowd. Now, I want you to hold on to that feeling for a second. How on earth does a live track that begins with this kind of venomous, confrontational energy end up turning into a vulnerable exploration of empathy? Well, that massive gap between the opening shout and the final lyric is exactly the journey we're going to map out today. All right, moving into section 1, the aggressive surface tone belying the fragility beneath. So in order to really understand the depth of the vulnerability here, we first have to appreciate the sheer thickness of the armor. The narrator completely sets us up to expect anger, but notice the immediate bait and switch the lyrics pull on us. We've got that intense hostility of the intro, but then, almost immediately, the text introduces phrases like trembling at the thought of feeling. The contrast is just staggering. We are primed for our brawl, but instead, we are handed a psychological profile of someone who is incredibly fragile. It forces us, as the audience, to instantly recalibrate our expectations. We aren't actually looking at a threat. We're looking at a defense mechanism. That brings us to section 2. Constructing the emotional wall, the architecture of defense. Let's look at how this builds into the physical and social barriers the subject constructs. Think about it. How do we hide when we are right in plain sight? The lyrics give us a very specific blueprint for this wall. Look at these 4 components: skin, jewelry, words, and eyes. The narrator notes these 4 specific, superficial, expressive tools that the subject uses to hide what's underneath. And it's brilliant, really, because these are usually the things we use to express our identity to the world. We wear jewelry to stand out, we use words to communicate, but here they are completely repurposed as bricks and mortar. They're camouflage. The subject is hiding behind the exact things meant to show who she is. Which brings us to the title phrase itself. The absolute crucial point here is that being cold and ugly isn't actually who she is. It's an abrasive defensive wall built symptomatically. And why? Because, as the lyric states so plainly, she is scared as hell. This is a monumental shift in perspective. When we encounter someone acting cold or acting ugly towards us, our first instinct is to just assume, well, that's the personality. But this text argues that hostility is often just a symptom of absolute terror. Let's move to section 3, the anatomy of numbness, refusing to feel. Diving into the chorus, we explore the deep psychological state of the subject trapped behind that wall. Let's isolate the word trembling for a second to really unpack the sheer emotional weight of this line. Trembling at the thought of feeling. Trembling is an involuntary physical reaction. You literally can't control it. And notice what she's trembling at. It's not a specific threat. It's not a monster in the dark. It is simply the thought of feeling. The terror is associated with experiencing any emotion whatsoever. The numbness isn't accidental. It's a desperate survival strategy because feeling anything is perceived as just too dangerous. And, well, the strategy actually works. Look at these lines. Wide awake and keeping distance, nothing seems to penetrate her. The defense mechanism is entirely effective. It ensures she stays hypervigilant. She's wide awake, right, watching everything. But she is completely numb to the outside world. Nothing penetrates. She has successfully isolated herself from any potential emotional harm. But, as we're about to see, that safety comes at a pretty devastating cost. Which leads into section 4, distance from the soul, the escalation of isolation. The bridge of the track takes us even deeper. We're transitioning from just keeping others away to a complete internal alienation. I mean, it's one thing to build a wall to keep other people out. It is an entirely different thing when that wall divides you from yourself.
This breaks down the poetic stanza into a stark, escalating psychological process of self-detachment. Step 1, you are wide awake, you're hyper-aware. Step 2, you keep your distance from others to stay safe. But then, look at Step 3, from my soul. This is the tragic climax of this defense mechanism. By numbing yourself to the outside world, you inevitably numb yourself to your own internal world. You lose touch with your own soul. The isolation is total.
I actually want to pause on this number for a second. 2. The lyrics in the bridge repeat this specific detachment process, wide awake and keeping distance from my soul, exactly 2 times. In songwriting, repetition is never an accident. It reinforces the feeling of being helplessly stuck in a loop. It mimics the cyclical nature of anxiety, doesn't it? You realize you're detached, which makes you anxious, which makes you detach even further. It's this beautifully subtle structural choice that perfectly mirrors the psychological trap the subject is in.
And finally, Section 5, the shared human fear, the mirror effect.
Here is where the entire narrative arc just twists. We shift from objectively observing the subject's fear from a safe distance to a startling, highly personal internal realization by the narrator. This brilliantly illustrates the transition of empathy. It maps out the exact moment the narrator realizes they are actually looking in a mirror. We spent the whole track looking at her fear. She's scared as hell. She's trembling. But suddenly, the lyrics pivot to my fear. I am frightened too. The narrator, who has been judging this cold and ugly wall the whole time, suddenly recognizes the exact same terror within themselves. The distance between the observer and the subject entirely collapses with these final admissions of shared terror. I am frightened too. I am scared like you. The pointing finger literally becomes an outstretched hand. By understanding that her ugly exterior was just a mask for fear, the narrator is able to access their own vulnerability. They aren't adversaries anymore. They're just 2 terrified people trying to protect themselves in a frightening world. To wrap up our explainer today, I really want to leave you with this profound thought, directly inspired by the text's deeply vulnerable conclusion. We started this journey with an aggressive shout, and we end with this realization: if the wall is cold and ugly, but underneath it we are all just frightened, who are we actually keeping out? Are we really protecting ourselves, or are we just locking ourselves in the exact same lonely room together, terrified to admit that we're exactly the same? Think about the walls you've built in your own life, and ask yourself, what are you really afraid of letting in?
That was AI's blind interpretation. Will it hold up to an interpretation that is guided with notes and references? Do you believe that I'm working hard or hardly working? You decide.
Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Man, I am absolutely thrilled you're here today, because we're about to deconstruct a truly legendary piece of alternative metal history. You know, when we think of bands that have meticulously crafted their own mythology, Tool is usually sitting right at the very top of that list. Their music is known for being complex, precise, and wrapped up in all these layers of meaning. But before the massive arena tours, before the mind-bending visual projections, and way before the platinum records, there was a raw, visceral beginning. Today, we're putting a microscope on a defining moment from their early career. It's a live recording that literally captured lightning in a bottle. We're talking about the track Cold and Ugly from their landmark Opiate EP. Honestly, by the end of this, you're going to hear this classic track with totally fresh ears. Throw that Bob Marley wannabe motherfucker out of here. Look, if you know early Tool, you've heard this line 1,000 times. It's that explosive spoken dialogue kicking off the live version of Cold and Ugly. I mean, it's aggressive, it's completely sudden, and it just perfectly sets the tone for that absolute frenzy of guitars and drums that hits right after. For decades, this single, off-the-cuff sentence shouted by frontman Maynard James Keenan, has been this massive piece of Tool lore. It perfectly captures the gritty, no-holds-barred attitude of the band's earliest days. But, for years, fans have debated the exact context of this hostile command. Okay, let's dive into this, because this is exactly where the mythology of music collides head-on with the sheer chaos of live performances. Who was on the receiving end of that infamous shout? Well, for a really long time, the music community had a widely accepted theory. It got passed around on message boards, debated among diehard fans, you name it. But as we so often find when digging into the history of legendary recordings, the truth is sometimes way stranger, and honestly way more chaotic than the rumors. So let's separate the myth from reality here. The long-standing rumor was that Maynard was yelling at none other than Zach De La Rocha, the legendary frontman of Rage Against the Machine. And honestly, this rumor made perfect sense on paper. Zach was a really close friend of the band, and he was absolutely right there in the room during this specific recording. However, history's been cleared up for us by Bill Manspeaker, the founder of the comedy rock group Green Yellow. Turns out, the reality is that the shout was directed at a friend of theirs named Donovan. Donovan was an artist within the Green Yellow collective, and he was reportedly just running around screaming into a megaphone, actively disrupting the live recording set. So, no, it wasn't some feud with a famous peer, it was literally just a frustrated reaction to an overenthusiastic friend trying to hijack the recording with a megaphone. I love this little detail because it gives us such a clear window into the incredibly chaotic, informal, and friend-filled atmosphere of Tool's earliest live shows. And that beautifully illustrates exactly what kind of recording we're dealing with here. Cold and Ugly isn't just a standalone live track. It's the first part of what's known as the Jello Loft Live Suite. This suite is made up of 2 live tracks featured on the Opiate EP, Cold and Ugly paired right alongside the track Jerk Off. Understanding this pairing is super vital. These aren't pristine studio tracks with endless layers of polish and production. They're a historical document. It's like an audio photograph of the band at a very specific time and place, capturing a kind of raw energy that you simply can't manufacture in a sterile recording booth. Let's really set the scene for this recording because the details are just wild. It's New Year's Eve, 1991. The audience isn't some massive crowd of ticket buyers. It's this super intimate group of friends crammed into a room, including people like Tom Morello. The sound they capture that night is high energy, totally raw, and unapologetically unpolished. But here is my absolute favorite detail. If you listen closely to the very beginning of Cold and Ugly, right around the chaos of the intro, you can hear a massive, visceral scream. That scream, it's not an artistic vocal effect. That is Green Jello founder Bill Manspeaker literally diving off a second-story balcony into the crowd right as the band starts their set. I just want you to imagine the sheer unbelievable chaos of that cramped room. You've got friends with megaphones, guys jumping off balconies, and a band absolutely tearing through their instruments. Inside the Jello Loft, breaking down the wall. To truly understand this recording, we really have to look past the party and examine the physical environment where this all went down. So where exactly was the Jello Loft? It was located right at the intersection of Sunset and Orange in Hollywood. But hey, don't let the Hollywood location fool you, this was definitely not a glamorous spot. The Jello Loft was a storied squat and art complex. It served as a central hub for the Green Jello Artist Collective. And more importantly for our explainer today, this was the exact space where Maynard James Keenan and drummer Danny Carey actually lived and rehearsed. This was an early 90s Hollywood squat. It was gritty, highly industrial, and frankly, a pretty dangerous environment at times. Grasping this space is absolutely crucial because the band wasn't just dropping in for a fun gig. They were trying to survive and create art within these harsh, unforgiving walls. Now, what's really interesting is how that physical reality starts to bleed into the art itself. Let's look at the opening verse. Underneath the skin and jewelry, hidden in her words and eyes, is a wall that's cold and ugly, and she's scared as hell. On the surface, Maynard is describing a person, right? Someone guarded, someone terrified, someone who's built up this massive, impenetrable defense mechanism just to face the world. But when we place those lyrics right next to the history we just uncovered, this brilliant duality emerges. On one hand, we have the psychological wall, the emotional state of being scared as hell, keeping your distance, feeling deeply frightened. And on the other, we have the physical wall, the actual, gritty, dangerous, industrial reality of the Hollywood squat they were living in. The cold and ugly energy of this live recording perfectly reflects their surroundings, the literal, physical walls of the Jello Loft, a tough environment that demanded serious survival instincts, mirror the emotional walls described in the song. It's this beautiful kind of terrifying synergy where the artist's lived reality becomes the literal metaphor for their psychological expression. And this theme of profound emotional isolation carries right into the chorus. The lyrics go, trembling at the thought of feeling, wide awake and keeping distance, nothing seems to penetrate her. And later in the chorus, he adds, I am frightened too, I am frightened. This perfectly matches the harsh, impenetrable energy of that Jello Loft recording. It's loud, it's aggressive, and it almost pushes you, the listener, back, much like the subject of the song keeping her distance. In the bridge, Maynard repeats, wide awake and keeping distance from my soul. The physical environment they recorded in was a fortress against the outside world, and the song itself is about a psychological fortress. They're essentially one and the same. Let's move along and see how this all builds into the broader legacy of the band. If we look at Tool's evolution, we can see the massive impact of this specific recording. Pre-1991, they were a local LA act, just grinding it out in the underground scene. Then we hit December 31st, 1991, this raw, do-it-yourself live recording at the Jell-O Loft, right in the middle of balcony dives and megaphone disruptions. This exact chaotic night, captured on tape, served as the catalyst that propelled them into their post-1991 era as a professional recording entity. The Opiate EP proved they had a sound and a fury that just demanded to be heard on a global scale. This messy, aggressive night in a Hollywood squat was the crucial bridge between obscurity and absolute legend. Which brings us to our final thought today. You know, when you listen to a pristine studio album, it is so easy to forget the dirt, the danger, and the struggle that originally forged a band's identity. So, I'll leave you with this question to ponder. How much does the literal, gritty environment an artist survives in directly shape the psychological depth and enduring legacy of their music? In the case of Tool's Cold and Ugly, the walls they lived within literally became the art they produced. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I highly encourage you to go back, put on your headphones, and listen to that live track again. Listen for the megaphone, listen for the balcony dive, and listen to the sound of history being made in the Jell-O Loft. Keep learning, and I'll see you next time.
Every time you run off back into your cozy little world without hitting like or subscribe, I get a little closer to this.